Now, we pushed back and pushed back hard last night against where the media, largely the activist media, have been all summer. I, like you, have been banging my head against a brick wall, screaming at the television, turning off the radio and changing the website, as people who are activists tried to parade as journalists. When people who tried to shape the news to build a narrative that Australia demanded some sort of Greens utopia be brought into existence because we'd never seen a bushfire before. Now, for those who missed those comments last night, they're up on my Facebook page or up at skynews.com.au, so I won't bore you by going back over it again. But for those lefties who have the assignment of having to dob to the teacher about what you do and don't hear and sometimes think you hear on Sky News, as I said last night, climate change is real. The extent of what we can do about it, well, that is what is always up for debate. Also, how much are we willing to bankrupt ourselves as an economy to do so? None of that is climate denialism, but all of that is part of the genuine debate. A debate that for the past month we have not been able to have. Why? Because people are being evacuated from their homes. Why? Because of bushfires, bloody awful bushfires. No one is pretending that the summer that we have just gone through wasn't one hell of a bad one. But the idea that it is the first of an endless rolling cataclysm of hell is perhaps a little too much. So now that the lefties don't own the media like they have for the past month, now that their "it's all ScoMo's fault" narrative can be seen for exactly what it is, activists who were trying to bring about the destruction of a person who they already hated. They hated last December, last October. They told us it was inevitable what the election was going to be in May of last year. The pent-up aggression meant that they had a target all summer long. But the pushback has begun. The sanity begins to prevail because you and I know there is a difference between federal, state and local government. But the lefties don't like it when they don't have total control. Their dream is that dissent is a debate about how fast we get to 100% renewables, not whether or not we should, not whether or not the technology can do what coal already currently does. They believe, because all they do is hang out in dinner parties where everyone agrees. Everyone agrees. And everyone repeats the lie that we're doing nothing. That as soon as they start to get a bit of pushback, the tantrums begin. One thing that absolutely has not changed, regardless of the terrible summer that Australia has had, is the 20-something-year-olds who love a tantrum. Or in the case of our former Prime Minister, a man who is a whole lot older than 20. Here are some of the tantrums that the left had today because it is not going their way anymore. They are not having 100% of the push. They are not getting their Greens utopia. Instead, normal, rational, sane Australia that have seen bushfires come and go, well, we're now back in charge. Kevin Rudd was on CNN overnight and, wow, of course, it's all the Murdoch media's fault. This is what he was telling an international audience of, well, thousands of people.
But the truth of the matter is that for the better part of a decade now, we've had continued Conservative government in Australia, which has run an agenda of climate change denial, reinforced by their partners in crime, the Murdoch media in Australia. The climate change debate is intensely polarising in Australia, like it is in the United States, like it is, frankly, in few other countries. And as a consequence, it becomes very hard to, A, introduce measures which measurably reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and B, transform our economy over time, and C, take our proper place as leading global climate change action in the councils of the world, rather than as the current Conservative government doing, which is undermining global consensus on climate change action.
Seriously, I know that bloke is quite fluent in how the Chinese work. You would think that he would understand. Also, I think his sort of apparent position now is to speak on the behalf of some pro-Asian institute, is that China, remember, can continue to increase its pollution all the way till 2030. So Australia taking its rightful place where people like himself would be able to fly on private jets, or at least business class, because, you know, we want to appear common, to be able to go from conference to conference to conference, pollution to pollution to pollution. That's what they want to do. Now, I know this pisses a lot of you off, but the truth is I believe climate change exists. You can't have 7 billion people on the planet without doing something to what would naturally be occurring. No question for me. But I know that there's a limit to what a country that produces 1 and a bit % of the problem for the world can actually do about that problem. And Kevin Rudd, of course, is very convenient when he turns around and bashes away at the Murdoch press. Editors, by the way, that he was more than willing to play footsies with before they endorsed him to become Prime Minister and replace John Howard. Apparently that's when the system was working for him. But he, of course, neglects to say that unlike the United States, Australia has one very big media company that has more television stations, more radio stations, and $1 and a bit billion in guaranteed funding each and every year. It's taxpayer radio, otherwise known as Channel 2. On top of that, don't forget the SBS. They are everywhere. And you don't think they try to shape the debate? As Mark Latham quite correctly tweeted a bit earlier tonight, an ABC News bulletin more looks like a 30-minute weather bulletin with some climate change debate thrown in. He'll join us on the show tomorrow night. Oh, but Rudster wasn't done.
I grew up on a farm, Fareed. I know what bushfires are like. Every decade or so, we'd have a big one. But none of us, repeat, none of us have seen anything like this. And the politics of fear around, let's call it, the cost of climate change action has been well mobilised by the Conservatives and Murdoch in Australia, just as been well mobilised in the United States by the Conservatives through the echo chamber of Fox News.
What a bitter little man he is. But we decided to double-check his claim that I'm a boy from a farm and we had a big bushfire every 10 years or so. How long did he actually spend on a farm? We went to that far right-wing think tank known as the Australian National Archives, which says about Kevin Rudd that he was on a farm until the end of primary school. This, of course, followed the tragic death of his father. But last time I checked, you're not 35 when you leave primary school. But every 10 years or so, he remembers, bushfires rolled in and rolled out. Some of the other people who are playing sookie games are the games where the state governments that have been able to get away with not copping their fair amount of the blame for how bad these fires were. We told you just before these fires got out of control late last year that there were some serious claims being made about what was happening in national parks in New South Wales. Were they cutting back on the number of people who are responsible for fighting fires? Were they cutting back on the amount of people who have direct responsibility for clearing out the debris at the bottom of those national parks that, if they ever get alight, supercharge fires? The answer was yes. But the state government thinks that it's still a couple of weeks ago, when only one media narrative was acceptable, when it was all the federal government's fault. Well, bugger that. So they're now out to distract. A bloke who would like to be the most powerful behind-the-scenes politician in New South Wales is a guy called Matt Keane. He's from the left of the Liberal Party, and he still thinks that if you say something that is kind of dodgy for the Prime Minister, well, then it'll become news. Only problem is the PM bit back. First, the Minister, who, by the way, is the Minister for National Parks in New South Wales, can we start asking him questions not about what may or may not be happening behind closed doors with his mates who are still loyal to the ghost, and start asking him some direct questions like, last year, how much did you clean up compared to 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Because tomorrow night on the show, I'll show you the actual numbers.
My understanding is some of the most senior members of the government, and they're not moderates, they're from the right of the party.
In Cabinet?
And they are saying that this is a huge issue.
In Cabinet?
In Cabinet, absolutely. And can I just say, Sherry, I mean, this is because their communities are crying out. They're listening to the majority of people in their electorates that are saying, we want you to protect our environment, but we don't want you to do it in a way that's going to destroy our economy.
Oh, but there's a massive fight that's happening inside the government about whether or not there should be an increase. Come on. Distraction politics at its best. Don't ask me about my actual responsibility, which is how do we run a national park. Instead, ask me about something I may or may not have heard, but probably am kind of making up. Exactly the point the Prime Minister made today, who is well and truly back in his groove.
I don't know what he's talking about.
So he's...
Are you dismissing what he's saying?
Well, I don't know what he's talking about. I think Matt should focus on hazard reduction, and I think Matt can focus on hazard reduction. I'll focus on emissions reduction.
Matt Keane doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know what's going on in the federal cabinet. Most of the federal cabinet wouldn't even know who Matt Keane was.
I love it. Now, of course, part of the power that Matt Keane has, and by all reports he's a nice guy, is that he is the factional boss of the left. The left has an awful lot of control in New South Wales. They're very close to, among others, Michael Photius, who, last time I checked, what's the bet that he's made when it comes to coal versus renewables? Ask these ministers about their responsibility, not the he said, she said, make up sources close to, no names, no detail. But the sooking continued from the left because they hate when we push back. But push back, we are, we will, and we will not stop, because the BS that we have been fed over the past month is unbelievable. Adam Bant tweeted this today. This is the Greens MP who was out there saying that Scott Morrison is a threat to life. We must rise up against this terrible government with a fury that matches the intensity of those terrible fires. / you were cheering them on because, well, it helps make your political point, doesn't it, Adam? I only surmise, I only guessed. Feel free to come on the show and correct me if I'm wrong. No more talk of watering down 20, 30 goals or mistakes, just a full-throated push to make Morrison act or go. Remember, the Greens wanted it their way. The media was trying to help them get their way, exacting revenge for an election. And despite the fact that we were told by all of those people writing think pieces from their holiday houses while pretending to be at work for the serious news publications, they said that Australia demanded massive action on climate change. Yet when the news poll came out, that, yes, was not good reading for the Prime Minister in terms of preferred Prime Minister, the grand total of the increase of the vote for the Greens, the party of climate revolution, 1 point. May the sooking continue. It'll only get more personal, and the one thing you can absolutely bet on between now and then is that they will lose their brains even more as the weeks and months roll on. To talk about the cost of how we transition, to talk about the cost of how we do our bit, is not climate denialism. It's called being an adult. Stamping your feet and demanding, why don't they do what I want them to do when I want them to do it, is what a toddler does.